I graduated high school in the summer of 2014, in the stretch of weeks where nothing had weight yet, and every night felt like it could hold something worth keeping. We were restless in the way only people without schedules are. We drove because driving was an excuse to be together. That was how we ended up at the playground built around the drained retention pond on the west side of the county, the one folded into a new housing development that still smelled like fresh sod and wet concrete. The pond had been emptied the year before after repeated flooding. The basin sat lower than the houses, a wide oval of cracked mud, pale weeds, and scattered trash that the wind pushed into drifts. A low metal fence traced its edge. Inside that ring, the developer had dropped a playground as an afterthought. 2 swing sets, a slide, a climbing dome, benches bolted into place. It was technically private. The gates stayed open because nobody cared enough to lock them. We had heard stories about kids hearing voices there after dark. The stories had no names, no details. They floated between people the way rumors always do. We treated them like decorations, something to hang the night on. The air was heavy when we parked, the kind that presses into your clothes. Cicadas buzzed in the distance. The development lights cut the darkness into squares and bands. The playground sat in one of those squares, a small island of pale sand and metal. We walked in without hurry. Our footsteps made a soft hiss in the sand. The swings hung still at first, their black seats dull, the chains filmed with a faint orange grit from the salt air. The slide had been sprayed with a thin layer of something sticky, sap or soda, that caught light along its curve. Everything looked abandoned in a way that felt recent, like people had left in a rush and meant to return. We spread out, touching the equipment, pushing lightly, laughing at nothing. The smell reached me before I noticed anything else. It was faint at first, a low note under the usual Florida night mix of cut grass and warm water. It carried the sourness of wet fur and the metallic edge of rust. It made the back of my tongue prickle. I assumed something small had died nearby, a raccoon or a cat. Developments are built on whatever was there before. The ground does not forget. We were near the swings when I saw one of them move. It was the one at the far end, half in shadow. The chain gave a slow twitch, a single link catching light as it shifted. I watched for wind in the weeds. Nothing stirred. The air pressed down without motion. The swing seat tipped forward, then back, a shallow arc as if nudged. I stood there long enough to let embarrassment rise and settle. Night exaggerates. The metal cools. Things expand and contract. The movement meant nothing. Then the swing beside it began to move too, the chains whispering against each other. Not wide, not playful, just enough to set the seats into a careful, uneven sway. The smell grew stronger as we stood there. It threaded into my nose, damp and coppery. The metal taste sat on my tongue. Something in me shifted from idle to alert. I became aware of the way the light fell off beyond the fence, of the thick line of scrub and slash pine that marked the property edge. That tree line looked darker than the rest of the night, dense in a way that swallowed the glow. From that direction came a sound I could not place at first. It was low and rhythmic, not loud enough to belong to anything large, not sharp enough to be insect song. It had a wet quality, a clicking close to the ground with a small pause between each set. It reminded me of pebbles touched together underwater. I watched the fence. It was chain link, bent in a few places where storms had thrown debris against it. The weeds at its base were matted. The clicking continued, steady, then faster, then steady again. It carried the sense of something working, not calling. One of my friends pointed without speaking. Beyond the fence, between 2 of the streetlights, something shifted. It did not cross the light the way a person would. It seemed to rise in pieces, a dark mass that gathered itself from the ground, changing shape as it moved. The outline was wrong for a deer, wrong for a dog. It stayed low, its back sloping. It advanced by compressing and releasing, a motion like something being folded and pushed forward. The light touched it in fragments. A curve here, a dull sheen there. I saw the glint of an eye and then lost it. The clicking sped up, the wet notes running together. The smell thickened. It felt close enough to breathe on my skin. We ran because the body decides before the mind can dress the reason. Sand sprayed under my shoes. The fence gate rattled as we shoved through. The world narrowed to the reach of the streetlights and the hollow thud of our feet. The clicking followed us for a few seconds, then fell away. The smell clung to me, woven into my breath. We did not stop until we were back in the car, doors slammed, windows up. My chest hurt from pulling air. My hands shook against the steering wheel. None of us laughed. The development lights receded in the mirrors. The night swallowed the square of the playground. I slept poorly. The smell lingered in my head, a phantom that woke me before dawn. When I got up, the bottoms of my shoes were tacky. A dark film clung to the rubber, caught in the shallow grooves. In the light, it had a dull reddish cast. It smelled of copper and rot, of something left too long in water. I scraped at it with a stick in the driveway. It stretched, then tore. The residue stuck to the wood in strings. I hosed the shoes. The water beaded and ran, but the smell remained. I threw them into a trash bag and dropped them in the bin. I could have left it there. It would have blurred into the long line of nights that hold more feeling than fact. What pulled me back was the residue. The way it behaved did not match mud or sap. It had body. It had weight. I returned to the playground 2 days later, alone in full sun. The development looked smaller by day. The houses stood in neat rows, their lawns already burning at the edges. The retention basin spread out like a shallow bowl. The cracked mud had been crossed by tracks I had not seen at night. Wide cloven prints, deep at the toe, pointed toward the tree line. They cut through the weeds and vanished into the brush. The smell met me at the gate. Stronger now, heated by the sun. It sat in the throat. Flies worried the air above the fence in slow black arcs. Inside, the swings hung still. The sand beneath them was churned, marked with the same prints. The far end of the fence bowed outward. One of the lower ties had been pulled loose, leaving a gap just wide enough for something broad to force itself through. Rust streaked the metal in thick runs. A dark smear stained the lower links. I followed the smell along the fence to where the ground dipped. The weeds parted to reveal a shallow wallow, a place where water had once stood. In its center lay what had drawn us there. A feral hog, on its side, legs stiff, hide split in places where insects had already found purchase. Its coarse hair was matted. Dried blood crusted its flank and pooled beneath it, thickened by the soil into a sticky paste that caught at my shoes. The copper smell rolled off it in waves. The head lay twisted toward the fence. The tusks were visible, yellowed, curved. The jaw hung open. When the flies lifted, I could see where the snout had been torn, where the animal had forced itself against the wire. The clicking I had heard fit now. Teeth striking metal, hooves scraping chain. The sound of an animal trying to work its way through something that would not give. Around the carcass, the mud shone with an oily sheen. Rust from the fence had leached into the damp soil. Iron bacteria had bloomed there in slick orange mats, the kind that forms where metal and stagnant water meet. When pressed, they stretch and cling. When dried, they darken. When mixed with blood and decay, they smell like coins and rot. I stood back, letting the scene settle into its parts. The swings had not moved by themselves. The prints ran beneath them. The hog had pushed through the playground at night, drawn by the lower ground, by whatever moisture lingered in the sand. It had brushed the swing chains as it passed. The slight movement we saw was the aftermotion of metal disturbed, the long, slow return to rest that heavy air can hide. The smell had been it, alive, close, its hide wet, its blood fresh. The shape between the streetlights had been its back rising and falling as it shifted weight, the way large animals move in low light, gathering and releasing. The residue on my shoes had been a mix of what lay here now. Blood from a fresh scrape, iron slime from the fence base, decomposed plant matter from the wallow. The copper scent fit, the tacky pull fit, the way it clung and stretched fit. A laminated notice had been zip-tied to the gate since our visit. It warned residents about feral hog activity in the area. It listed a number for animal control. The developer had built on a corridor these animals had used long before lawns and sidewalks were poured. The drained pond had been a stop for them. Its absence had not erased the habit. I did not cross the fence again. The flies thickened in the heat. The carcass would be removed. The fence would be mended. The smell would fade. The tracks would fill with dust. The stories would continue because the shape of that place invites them. When I left, I washed my hands at the car with bottled water. The smell clung faintly to my skin. It faded only after several scrubbings, after the sun and time broke it down into nothing. What remains with me is not the fear we carried out of there, but the clarity that came after, the way the night rearranged ordinary things into something that felt impossible until daylight returned them to their edges. We did not meet anything that night that did not already live alongside us. We met the cost of forgetting where we build and the truth that empty spaces are never empty. I lived there. That's the part that still bothers me the most. The neighborhood was new enough that the trees still looked temporary. Thin trunks, small crowns, every yard rolled out from the same plan. Beige siding, stone trim, black shutters. The houses sat close, but never close enough to feel like a city. Identical mailboxes stood at the curb like markers. Everything had been finished around the late 2000s, after the last cornfield was scraped flat. I moved in during 2016, late 20s, first stable job, quiet routines, no pets, no roommates. The place felt safe because nothing stood out. The first weeks passed without problems. I learned the sound of the pipes, the click of the furnace, the soft pop of the house settling at night. I parked in the driveway, kept the garage empty, mowed once a week. I used the side gate often because it was closer to the trash cans. It latched with a simple spring and a metal hook. I checked it out of habit. The fear started small. One morning the trash cans stood a few inches from where I left them. Not tipped, not knocked, just shifted. I blamed wind even though the night had been still. A few days later the side gate hung open. I knew I had closed it because I always listened for the sound of the hook falling into place. I told myself I was tired. Around the same time I installed a doorbell camera. It was cheap, battery-powered, and linked to my phone. Mostly it showed passing cars, delivery trucks, neighbors on evening walks. After a week it began recording brief clips around 2:40 a.m. almost every night. The motion alerts never triggered properly. No notification sound. I only saw the clips when I opened the app to check the battery. The video never showed a full shape. Something crossed the bottom edge of the frame, low to the sidewalk, too long to be a cat, too flat to be a raccoon. It looked wrong because it never appeared all at once. One frame showed a curved mass like a shoulder. The next showed a pale bend. Then nothing. When I scrubbed through frame by frame, there was no complete outline. It was always pieces. A smooth back without hair. A dark hollow like a crease. The camera time stamp stayed steady. The compression glitched around it. I blamed the software. I stopped checking after a while because the clips made my skin feel tight. The trash cans kept shifting. The gate stayed open more often than closed. I started locking it with a carabiner. Twice I found it unclipped. The lawn stayed clean until early summer when I noticed shallow impressions near the curb. They weren't footprints. They were depressions, spaced unevenly, pressed into the soil like someone had dragged weight across it. They led from the storm drain cut into the curb toward my yard. The grass bent inward, blades crushed flat. The marks stopped beneath my bedroom window. There was no trail back. The soil past that point looked untouched. I knelt and touched one of the depressions. The dirt was packed smooth, not scuffed. The edges were rounded, as if pressed slowly. I stood and looked at the drain. The opening was wide enough for a child. The grate sat loose inside its frame. That night I slept on the couch. I kept the lights off. The house sounded different from downstairs. The refrigerator motor, the tick of the wall clock, the whisper of air through vents. At 2:40 a.m. my phone vibrated. The app showed another clip. I did not watch it until morning. Weeks passed that way. I lived in the lower rooms. I showered with the door open. I locked everything before dark. The impressions returned whenever it rained. Always from the drain. Always ending under the same window. The grass there never recovered. It stayed pressed, as if someone kept resting weight on it. I bought a stronger camera and mounted it lower, angled along the sidewalk instead of across it. The first night it recorded nothing. The second night it caught a blur that smeared across the lens, too close to focus. The third night it recorded a shape that filled the bottom of the frame. Skin. Pale. Smooth. The surface curved like a back. The movement was slow and sliding, not stepping. The clip ended before anything else appeared. I began to smell something faint in the upstairs hall during the day. A sour, damp odor like old water. I cleaned the carpet. I checked the bathroom drain. I ran the garbage disposal. The smell lingered near the bedroom. It grew stronger after rain. One afternoon I noticed dust on the baseboard had been disturbed beneath the window. A thin line ran along the trim, the kind left when something brushes against it. The window itself was locked. The screen was intact. The wall beneath felt solid. I finally moved the bed and pressed my ear to the wall. I heard nothing. I pressed my palm flat and felt cold. That night I stayed awake on the couch, lights off, phone charging beside me. At 2:37 a.m., I heard a faint sound from above, not footsteps, not a thump, but a slow shifting, like fabric dragged across concrete. It continued for several minutes. The smell drifted down the stairwell. The next morning I climbed the stairs and stood in the bedroom doorway. The room looked unchanged. The carpet showed no marks. The bed frame had not moved. Only the smell lingered, stronger now, like wet stone and sweat. I called in sick and spent the day examining the house. I checked the attic. It was empty. I checked the crawlspace access in the closet. The panel screws were loose. I removed them and shone a flashlight inside. The space was shallow, lined with plastic vapor barrier. The beam caught on something near the foundation wall beneath the window. A dark opening cut through the concrete. It was rough, not part of any vent. The edges were chipped. The hole was large enough for a shoulder. The smell poured out of it. I lay on my stomach and aimed the light inside. The beam revealed a narrow tunnel sloping downward, packed earth reinforced with scraps of wood. Fabric hung from a nail. A crushed plastic bottle lay on its side. The air moving through it was cool. I backed away and closed the panel. I stood for a long time listening. The house was silent. I did not call anyone yet. I needed to understand. I returned with gloves, a dust mask, and a longer flashlight. I opened the crawlspace again and pushed my shoulders inside. The plastic crackled under my weight. The tunnel began a few feet in, carved through the foundation where the concrete had thinned near the footing. The workmanship was crude but patient. Tool marks lined the walls. The slope led toward the front of the house. I crawled only far enough to see that the tunnel continued for several yards. The earth smelled of rust and water. Near the entrance lay a folded blanket, stiff with dirt. A pair of worn shoes sat side by side, their soles smooth. A small pile of food wrappers rested against the wall. Everything looked used but arranged. I retreated and sealed the panel again. I left the house and sat in my car. My hands shook against the steering wheel. The drain in the curb suddenly made sense. The impressions ended beneath the window because that was where the tunnel met the foundation. The shape on the camera was someone moving close to the ground to stay below the field of view. The parts in the frame were shoulders and back, caught inches from the lens. I contacted the city that afternoon. The call routed through Public Works because the drain was involved. By early evening a crew arrived, then police, then a building inspector. I waited on the sidewalk while they examined the curb. They removed the grate. Beneath it the drain pipe had been widened by hand, its concrete lip chipped away. The opening extended into a dark passage that sloped toward my yard. They traced the tunnel from the street to my crawl space. It ran under the sidewalk, under the lawn, under the foundation. It had taken months to carve. The inspector photographed the hole in my foundation and shook his head. The police searched the tunnel and the storm drain system connected to it. They found more belongings tucked into a side cavity near the curb. Food containers, a flashlight, a small battery pack, a stained mattress pad. They did not find the person. Over the next days the city sealed the drain and filled the tunnel. Contractors repaired the foundation and replaced the soil. The crawlspace opening was patched with concrete and steel mesh. The smell faded. The impressions stopped appearing. The cameras recorded only passing cars again. A report arrived in the mail a week later. It listed the damage, the dates, the measurements of the tunnel. It stated that the passage connected to a network of old drainage culverts that ran beneath the development, remnants from before the land had been cleared. It suggested that someone had been living inside those culverts and had chosen my house because the foundation sat close to a bend where water pooled and soil softened. It explained the low movement, the lack of footprints, the time pattern matching when the street stayed quiet. It concluded that the individual likely used the tunnel to approach the exterior wall, listen, and return before dawn. I read the report several times. It did not speculate on why my house had been chosen beyond convenience. It did not say how long the person had been there before I noticed. It did not say where they went. I moved out 2 months later, after the repairs were complete. The house sold quickly. New grass grew where the lawn had been pressed flat. The curb looked untouched. The drain grate sat tight in its frame. I still think about the weeks I slept upstairs while someone lived beneath my feet. I think about the slow pressure in the soil, the careful work against concrete, the way the camera could never show a whole body because the body was never meant to be seen. The fear no longer comes from not knowing. It comes from knowing how close a person can be, how quietly a place can be changed, and how normal a house can look while it is being hollowed from below. My name is Mark. In 2018, I rented a basement apartment in a quiet New Jersey suburb because it was cheap and close to my job. The place was carved out of the lower level of a split-level house built in the late 70s. Low ceilings, thin walls, one small bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom that always smelled faintly of rust, and a living area that never felt fully dry no matter how long I ran the dehumidifier. The landlord and his family lived upstairs. From the first week, I could hear them through the ceiling. Footsteps, a television, the rush of water. None of that bothered me. I grew up in apartments. I was used to noise. What bothered me was the timing. After 10 at night, the normal sounds stopped. No TV, no voices, no showers. The house felt shut down. Then something else would begin. Heavy movement. Not walking. Not pacing. Pressure sliding across the ceiling above my bedroom. Slow and deliberate. Sometimes there were long scraping noises, as if a table were being pulled inch by inch. Other nights there was a dragging rhythm, uneven, followed by soft thuds. Once, when I lay in bed with the lights off, it sounded like something crawling, the kind of sound a person makes when they don't have the space to stand. The first month, I blamed the house itself. Old wood shifts. Pipes knock. I told myself that whatever I was hearing was the structure settling, or maybe the landlord up late, rearranging something. But the movements never matched normal routines. They always started after the house should have been asleep, and they never followed straight lines. The sounds circled. They paused. They resumed from different directions. Sometimes they lasted minutes. Sometimes more than an hour. I began staying up later, not out of fear at first, but out of curiosity. I'd turn off the lights and lie still. The ceiling was only a few feet above my face. I could trace the floor plan of the apartment above by sound. Living room to the left. Kitchen overhead. Bedrooms further back. The noises did not stay in one room. They moved across the entire span, slow and heavy, with irregular stops that made no sense for furniture or appliances. The basement had its own entrance. A side door at ground level led into a short hallway and then down a flight of stairs. One night in late October, I came home earlier than usual. It had rained hard. The air outside was cold and smelled like wet leaves. When I opened the side door, I saw dark marks on the concrete landing. Wet footprints leading down the basement stairs. They weren't shoe prints. There was no tread, no edge. Each mark was a full foot pressed flat, wide at the front, narrow at the heel. 5 long toe shapes spread too far apart. The stride was short and uneven, as if the person placing them had been unstable or low to the ground. The water had dripped from the toes, leaving thin trails that ran toward the wall. The footprints ended at the bottom step. I stood there a long time. The concrete was cold through my shoes. The air below carried that basement smell of damp insulation and dust. Nothing moved. The lights were off. I went down slowly, turned on the hallway light, and checked the apartment. The place was empty. No open windows. No water running. No sign of anyone. The next morning, I checked the stairs again. They were dry. The marks were gone. I cleaned anyway. Bleach and hot water. The memory of the shape stayed in my head. I told the landlord about it. He said nobody had been downstairs. The way he said it felt final. Not defensive. Not confused. Just a flat statement. After that, the sounds changed. They didn't stop, but they became closer. The movements above my bedroom grew heavier, more focused. I'd lie in the dark and feel the vibration through the ceiling drywall. The scraping took on a rougher edge, like skin or fabric against wood. There were nights when I could track the motion from the far end of the house all the way until it settled directly above my head. Sleep became shallow. I started waking before the noises, as if my body expected them. I left lights on. I kept the television playing quietly. The apartment never felt empty again. The air seemed to press back when I walked through it, thick and stale. In December, I woke from a half-dream with the sense that someone was near my bed. My room was dark. The dehumidifier hummed in the corner. The ceiling above me creaked once, then stilled. I rolled onto my side and felt a faint vibration through the wall. Then I heard breathing inches from my ear, coming from inside the wall. Not through the wall. Inside it. It was slow and uneven. Wet, strained. There was a faint whistling sound on the inhale, like air forced through a narrow opening. The exhale rattled. I could tell exactly where it was. Between 2 studs. The sound traveled along the cavity, close enough that I could feel it as much as hear it. The drywall was cold against my cheek. The breathing continued for several seconds, then stopped. I did not move until the light came up through the small window near the ceiling. The next day, I called out from work. I went home and emptied my bedroom closet. I removed the baseboards and unscrewed the outlet plate on the wall where I'd heard the breathing. The gap behind it was narrow. I shone a flashlight into the space. I saw insulation and the dark outline of framing. Then I saw something else. Not an object. A shape that didn't match the structure. A patch of skin, pale and mottled, pulled tight over something rounded. It withdrew when the light hit it. I dropped the flashlight. The following hours blurred. I didn't go back into the apartment. I drove to a hardware store, bought a stronger light, gloves, a respirator. I called the township building office and left a message. When I returned, I started in the utility area where the walls were unfinished. Exposed studs. Old wiring. The space behind the finished walls connected to a crawl space that ran under the stairs and along the foundation. The opening was hidden behind a screwed-in plywood panel. I removed it. The crawl space was low and narrow. The dirt floor was packed down. There were drag marks in the dust. Handprints. A nest of old blankets pushed into one corner. Empty water bottles. Canned food. Plastic bags. The smell was strong and sour, layered over mold. The space extended under my bedroom wall. A thin strip of light from the basement window cut across it. In that light, I saw the source of the sounds. A man lay half on his side, half on his stomach. His limbs were thin, the joints enlarged. His back was curved from years of moving through spaces too small to stand. His feet were bare. The front of them was broad and misshapen. The toes splayed far apart, swollen and stiff. The skin was cracked. The nails thick. His clothes were damp. His hair was long and stuck to his scalp. His eyes were open. His chest rose and fell with the same wet rhythm I'd heard through the wall. He did not try to speak. He did not try to move away. He stayed where he was, breathing, his eyes following the light. Later, after the police and inspectors came, the explanation filled itself in. The man was the landlord's brother. A middle-aged adult with untreated medical problems, cognitive impairment, and a history of wandering. Years earlier, after a fall and a long hospital stay, he had stopped using stairs. The family had turned part of the crawl space into a place he could stay without being seen. They fed him. They brought him water. They had cut small access points between the walls so he could move through the lower level without coming upstairs. He spent his nights crawling the length of the house because he could not sleep. The sounds I heard were his hands and forearms pulling his body across the subfloor. The scraping was fabric and skin. The heavy thuds were his shoulders striking joists. On rainy nights, he followed the damp air toward the side entrance, where water pooled near the door. He stepped into it. He went down the stairs when the house was quiet, drawn by the cooler space. The footprints were his. The wide spread of his toes came from swelling and years of weight placed on the fronts of his feet. When he heard me, he retreated back into the walls. The breathing in my room came from a cut between studs, concealed behind drywall and trim. The opening was small, meant for air. He had pressed his face against it. The family was cited. The space was condemned. The man was taken to a care facility. The basement apartment was declared uninhabitable until the walls were opened and repaired. I broke my lease that day. I moved out within a week. I did not pack at night. I did not sleep there again. Months later, after the walls had been opened, an inspector told me the crawl space had been larger than anyone realized, running like a second hallway system beneath the house. The boards were scarred. The insulation was flattened. There were old stains where his hands had rested. I still think about how easily sound travels through wood, how little separates one room from the hidden spaces inside a building. The house had never been empty. I had just been living on the wrong side of its walls. I moved back to my childhood suburb in Northern California in the spring of 2016, 2 weeks after my girlfriend packed her car while I was at work and left a note on the counter. I took a short lease on a small ranch house at the end of a cul-de-sac built in the late 80s. The place still smelled faintly of the lemon cleaner my mother used when I was a kid. The roofs all sloped at the same angle. The mailboxes matched. Most of the lawns had gone yellow by August. The streetlights were spaced far apart, leaving long dark stretches between warm circles of light. At night, The air cooled fast and carried the scent of dry dirt and the eucalyptus from the park 2 blocks away. I started jogging after midnight because sleep came in broken pieces and my head felt less crowded when my lungs burned. The street emptied early. By 11, the televisions went dark behind curtains. Garage doors closed. The cul-de-sac settled into a stillness broken only by the hum of distant traffic and sprinklers clicking on in other neighborhoods. My route was simple: down the curve, past the identical houses, out to the main road, then back again. I kept my pace slow. I wanted time to think. On my 3rd night run, I noticed the porch light on the house across from the bend. It glowed a pale amber and threw a narrow fan of light across the concrete. Every other house was dark. I assumed someone had forgotten to switch it off. The next night it was still on. A week later, I passed it nearly 3 in the morning, and it was still on. No cars in the driveway. No other lights inside. Just that porch light, steady and unblinking. The house had always been a little off. Even when I was younger, the blinds were usually closed. The paint was a shade darker than the rest. The front windows were frosted, a textured glass that blurred shapes into pale smears. During the day, it reflected the sky. At night, it turned the inside into a dull screen. I kept jogging past it. The light became part of the street. Moths drifted through its beam. The concrete beneath looked chalky. The longer I watched it, the more it felt like a marker, a small lighthouse in a cul-de-sac that otherwise vanished after dark. One night in early June, the air was warmer than usual. My shirt stuck to my back. I slowed as I came around the bend, letting my breathing even out. As I passed the house, something shifted behind the frosted glass. It was not a clear movement, like someone walking past a window. It was a change in tone, a darker shape rising behind the blur. The glass smeared the edges, stretched the outline. The form seemed too tall for the room. The top reached higher than the window frame would allow for an average person. The shoulders were set wide, sloping in a way that did not match any posture I recognized. It paused, as if it had noticed me, though there was no way it could see through the glass from the inside with the porch light blazing. I kept moving. My pace picked up without a decision. When I reached the end of the street, my calves ached. I looked back. The porch light glowed. The window held no shape. I told myself it had been a trick of shadow and the uneven glass. I took a different route the next night, looping the longer way to avoid that bend. I did the same the night after. The cul-de-sac fell out of my routine. I thought of it less. My sleep improved. 2 weeks later, after a day of heavy heat, a thunderstorm rolled through just before dusk. It was the kind that spat rain hard for 10 minutes and then left everything steaming. I went out late, after the pavement had dried enough not to slick my shoes. The main road felt loud. I missed the quiet. Without planning to, I turned back toward the cul-de-sac. The porch light was on. The street smelled of wet leaves and dust. My shoes made a soft hiss with each step. As I came closer, I noticed dark smears on the driveway, thin lines of mud tracked across the pale concrete. They crossed from the side yard to the center and then broke apart, as if someone had shuffled. I slowed to a walk. My pulse ticked in my ears. The front of the house was empty. No movement behind the glass. The mud marks ended near the steps. I went home and slept badly. I dreamed of standing in my old bedroom, counting the squares in the acoustic ceiling, aware of a weight above me that never shifted. In the morning, I found footprints in my own yard. They started near the fence that separated my lot from the next. The ground there stayed soft because the shade lingered. The prints were deep, the kind made by heavy boots. They cut across the grass toward the side of my house, then angled toward the back. I followed them around to the narrow strip beneath my bedroom window. There, directly under the sill, they stopped. The grass there was pressed flat. The dirt showed a half-moon heel. The toe was long and narrow. The pattern was not one I recognized. I stood there for a long time, looking at the faint dent in the soil, at the streak where something had brushed the siding. I called the non-emergency number. An officer came later that morning. He walked the line of prints, took photos, measured the length with his own shoe. He checked the fence and the latch on my gate. He wrote notes on a pad. He said it was probably a prank or someone cutting through yards after the rain. He left me a card and a report number. He suggested motion lights. I bought 2 that afternoon and mounted them under the eaves. I trimmed the hedge by my window. That night, I locked every door and lay on my back until dawn, listening to the house settle and the refrigerator hum. I stopped running at night. The The cul-de-sac took on a different weight when I drove through it in daylight. I found myself glancing at the house with the porch light. The mud on the driveway had dried and flaked away. The glass showed only sky. A month passed. Then another. I avoided the street on foot. I kept the lights on in my bedroom. Nothing else happened. In October, a realtor's sign went up on the lawn across the bend. The porch light stayed on. The sign stood there through rain and wind. No open house balloons. No weekend traffic. By December, the sign came down. The county website listed the house as sold. Nobody moved in. The driveway stayed empty. The blinds remained closed. Some nights, the porch light went dark. Other nights, it glowed. I asked around in small ways, in comments to neighbors I passed while taking out trash. I learned the house had been owned by a man who worked maintenance at a local office park. He had died of a heart attack. The sale had gone through to a company that bought properties in bulk. They had not found a tenant. The months went on. Winter brought fog that pooled in the street and erased the far houses. On those nights, the porch light hung in the mist like a weak star. It made the glass look milky. I sometimes slowed my car when I passed, scanning the window for any dark shift. I never saw one. In the spring of the next year, I received a copy of a follow-up note added to the old report. The officer had closed it after another resident on the block called about someone seen behind the empty house late at night. The note included an incident from a nearby neighborhood. A man arrested for breaking into vacant homes and using them as places to sleep and watch surrounding properties. He had been tall, according to the description, well over 6 feet. In his truck, they had found drywall stilts, the kind used for ceiling work, and a set of oversized boots modified to strap over them. They had also found a headlamp and a pair of binoculars. The address list attached to the arrest included my cul-de-sac. The pieces slid into place with a sickening calm. The height behind the frosted glass. The wrong shoulders, broadened by a harness and straps. The muddy prints with their long, narrow toes. The way they stopped beneath my window, where my room light had burned late into the night after the breakup. I drove to the house that afternoon. The porch light was off. The door was sealed with a thin metal bar and a new lock. A notice from the management company was taped inside the window. The glass blurred it into a pale rectangle. I walked the edge of the yard. Near the side, where the fence met the back corner, the ground still dipped in faint hollows that matched the old prints. Under my bedroom window, the hedge had grown back, but I could still see the scrape in the paint where something had brushed it. I went home and stood in my room, looking down at the strip of dirt. I imagined the weight of someone there, balancing on narrow supports, adjusting their height to clear the sill. I imagined the porch light on a simple dusk-to-dawn sensor, clicking on when the sky dimmed, staying lit because nobody ever told it to stop. The house across the bend remains empty. The management company mows the lawn once a month. The blinds never open. Some nights, when the fog drifts low or the heat keeps me awake, I notice the porch light glowing again. I know now it runs on a timer set long ago. I know the shape I saw was a man stretched taller by tools meant for work. I know the prints in my yard came from someone who had been watching a lit window and chose a quiet street because it was easy. I keep my curtains closed. I run in the mornings. The cul-de-sac looks harmless in daylight, all the same roofs and pale concrete, the same tired lawns. At night, when that single light burns and the rest of the street falls away, it reminds me how little separates a lived-in house from an empty one, and how thin the line can be between being alone and being observed. After the divorce, the house felt too large for one person. I stayed because the mortgage was manageable and the neighborhood felt safe. It was a planned place. Cul-de-sac, mature trees, lawns trimmed on the same day each week. Southern California quiet that carried itself like a promise. In 2019, nothing about it suggested danger. I slept with windows open. I left shoes by the door. I locked up without thinking. The first time I noticed the front door unlocked, I assumed I had made a mistake. I stood there in the morning with my keys in my hand, looking at the bolt turned open. The deadbolt had a clean throw and a solid click. I always checked it before bed. I had started checking twice after the divorce, as a habit to replace another habit I had lost. Still, it was possible I missed it once. I locked it, went to work, and forgot about it by lunchtime. A week later it happened again. Same door. No marks. No splintering. No scuffs near the handle. The strike plate looked untouched. The doorframe was tight, the hinges firm. I stood inside and tested it. It locked and unlocked cleanly. I felt a small pulse of irritation, the kind that comes from misplacing an object and suspecting yourself. I bought a new lock that weekend, a keypad model with an internal log. I installed it myself and changed the code. After that, the door stayed locked, but the house began to change in ways that were harder to dismiss. A chair in the dining room moved a few inches from the table. The rug by the couch showed long, flattened paths, as if someone had paced back and forth. The bath mat lay straight when I knew I left it bunched. These were small things, and I work long hours. I told myself the house settled. I told myself memory was unreliable during stress. I told myself the divorce had sharpened my attention in unhelpful ways. The mirrors were harder. In the guest bathroom, the mirror had been wiped clean in straight vertical lines, close together, starting near the top edge and ending far lower. I am tall, but not that tall. The lines were even, as if done in a single motion with a cloth held flat. There were no smears near the sink, no drops on the counter. It looked deliberate. I wiped it clean myself and marked the corner with a dot of toothpaste I would notice. The next morning, the dot was gone and the same lines were back, higher this time. I checked the attic for leaks, for animals. The hatch was sealed with screws. Insulation lay undisturbed. The crawlspace vents were intact. Windows showed no pry marks. Nothing was missing. No food. No clothes. No tools. My laptop sat where I left it. Cash stayed in my wallet. It was not theft. It felt like maintenance. I started taking photos before bed. I lined up the dining chairs. I smoothed the rugs. I set a glass on the counter with a paper towel folded under it to show movement. In the morning, the glass had not moved, but the towel lay unfolded, pressed flat, with a crease that ran straight down the middle. The chairs were still aligned. The rug showed new compression marks, parallel and evenly spaced. Sleep changed. I woke earlier, without dreams. I listened for sounds and heard only the house, the small clicks of cooling wood, the distant hiss of traffic. I felt watched in a way that did not feel emotional. It felt procedural, like being measured. I asked neighbors if they had noticed anything odd on the street. I did not mention the house. I walked more in the evenings and paid attention to routines. Lights went on at the same times. Garage doors opened and closed with steady rhythm. The neighborhood cameras were common. Doorbells with lenses. Motion alerts. I asked if anyone would be willing to check their footage if something happened. They agreed, in the way people agree to general concern. The keypad lock log showed entries at times I was home and awake, and no entries when I slept. That suggested the door stayed locked all night. It did not suggest access. I checked the back door. It was locked. I checked the side gate. It was locked. The fence was intact. The gate had a small clearance at the bottom where the concrete dipped, a gap that let water pass during rain. It was not large enough for a person. One morning, I found the couch shifted several inches away from the wall. The legs had left clear marks on the hardwood, faint arcs that suggested it had been rolled, not lifted. I do not own furniture with wheels. The marks were smooth and continuous. I measured them. They were evenly spaced like a track. I set up a camera inside the living room, pointed toward the door and couch. It recorded nothing overnight. The file was complete. No gaps. No motion alerts. I moved the camera to the hallway. Nothing. I moved it to the guest bathroom. Nothing. The mirrors changed again. The idea that someone could be inside the house without triggering sensors did not feel dramatic. It felt technical. It suggested planning. It suggested familiarity with blind spots. It suggested someone patient enough to make changes small. I called the manufacturer of the camera. I checked firmware. I changed networks. I added a second camera from a different brand. I placed it low, near the baseboard, aimed across the floor. That night, it captured a blur near the couch at 3:12 a.m. The blur was long and low, smooth, moving without visible stops. It crossed the frame in less than a second. It did not resolve into limbs. It did not trigger motion on the other cameras. I showed the clip to a technician. The explanation was rolling object, low contrast, motion blur. The technician suggested a robot vacuum. I do not own one. The tracks by the couch matched the blur height. I checked the garage. The door logs showed no openings overnight. The car had not moved. The driveway gate log showed no openings. A neighbor across the street checked his Ring footage from the night before. At 3:14 a.m., something left my driveway. It did not open the gate. It passed through the lower part of the frame and exited left. The motion was smooth and level, like a platform gliding. The camera caught no legs, only a long dark shape that reflected a thin line of light along its top edge. It did not trigger the motion zones set higher. The explanation came from measurements. The gate clearance at the bottom was 5 inches at its widest. The blur height matched 4 inches. The couch tracks were spaced the width of a narrow dolly. The mirrors were wiped in vertical lines that could be reached by someone standing on a platform that raised them. The flattened rugs showed long, straight passes, not footfalls. I spent a day inspecting the house with a contractor. He found an access panel above the hallway closet that I had never opened. It was painted to match and secured with magnets. Above it, a narrow service space ran along the attic edge, just tall enough to crawl. Insulation had been pressed flat in 2 long paths. There was a battery-powered work light taped to a beam, turned off. There were microfiber cloths folded and clean. There was a low-profile dolly with rubber wheels, the kind used to move appliances, modified with a flat platform and a hand grip. There was a skateboard, the trucks removed, the deck smooth. There were knee pads. There was a small step stool that collapsed flat. There was also a notebook with dates and times, measurements of rooms, notes about camera angles, and a schedule that matched my work hours. There were entries about airflow and noise. There were notes about mirror heights and lighting glare. There were no names. There was no language of threat. It read like a project plan. The contractor recognized the workmanship on the access panel. It matched a renovation done 2 owners before me. A contractor who had lived on the street and later moved, but kept his business local. The city records showed he had lost his license after a complaint. A police report later connected him to similar cases, houses where nothing was taken and small changes accumulated until the owners noticed. He used the service spaces of older homes, accessed through panels he installed during renovations. He entered and exited on low platforms to avoid motion sensors, used gaps under gates, stayed below camera zones, and unlocked doors only to test locks, not to enter. He wiped mirrors to test reach and presence. He rolled furniture to map resistance and noise. He left when attention increased. The police removed the equipment. They dusted for prints. They logged the notebook. They did not find him that week. I stayed elsewhere for a month. The house was sealed. Access panels were screwed shut. Cameras were reset. Motion zones were lowered. The gate clearance was filled. I moved back in. Nothing changed after that. The house stayed still. The mirrors stayed as I left them. The rugs held their pile. The door logs remained quiet. The neighborhood continued its routines. I sold the house the next year. I disclosed everything. The buyers still wanted it. The market was strong. I live now in a smaller place with fewer hidden spaces. I lock the door. I check the mirrors. I sleep. I do not feel watched. I feel measured only by myself, which is enough. I went there to reconnect with friends, not to look for anything strange. In 2015, we were all drifting in different directions, working long hours, living in rented places that never felt settled. Someone suggested we meet for a weekend at a friend's house outside Leeds, the same house where we had spent evenings years earlier drinking cheap beer and talking about plans that never happened. It sounded simple and safe. I expected familiar rooms, old habits, and the kind of quiet that comes with suburban streets. The house sat at the edge of a new estate that had stopped expanding. Beyond the back fence, the land dropped slightly and stretched into a long strip of greenbelt that hadn't been developed. It was not wild countryside. It was a narrow band of scrub, hedgerows, small trees, and rough grass running behind several properties, like a forgotten seam between neighborhoods. During the day, it looked harmless. The hedges were dense and old, grown together into a living wall that marked the boundary. You could see gaps where foxes or rabbits had passed through, and the ground beyond was uneven and muddy. The first afternoon felt normal. We unpacked bags, cooked food, and moved through the house with the comfort of people who already knew where light switches were. The back garden was small, neat, and fenced on 3 sides, with a greenbelt hedge forming the 4th. The grass was clipped short. The fence was solid, waist-high, with weathered panels and concrete posts. There was nothing inviting about going beyond it. The ground on the other side sloped, and disappeared into brush. As evening settled, the light faded earlier than I expected. Winter was close. The sky went flat and gray, and the temperature dropped fast. We stood in the garden for a while, bundled in coats, just to stretch our legs. The quiet was noticeable. No traffic noise, no voices, only the faint hum of distant roads carried by wind. The houses on either side had their lights on, curtains drawn. The greenbelt darkened into a continuous mass. That was when I noticed movement along the hedgerow. It was not fast. It did not dart or rush. Something moved parallel to the fence, just beyond it, staying low and close to the hedge. At first I assumed it was an animal. Foxes were common, and I had seen them before slipping through gardens without a sound. But this movement was different. It was steady and measured, keeping a consistent distance from us. When we walked along the fence line, it moved with us. When we stopped, it stopped. The hedge was thick enough that I could not see a shape, only the disturbance of branches and leaves pressed aside. There was no sound of breathing, no snapping twigs, only the soft brushing of vegetation. The distance between us never changed. It stayed just out of sight. I paid attention to the dogs inside the house. There were two, both usually reactive to anything near the garden. They lay flat on the kitchen floor, bodies pressed to the tiles, heads low, eyes open. They did not bark. They did not growl. They did not move toward the door. They stayed still, as if trained to hide. That reaction unsettled me more than the movement itself. Dogs bark at foxes. They bark at cats, at hedgehogs, at nothing. These dogs refused to make a sound. Their bodies were tense in a way I had only seen during thunderstorms. We stayed outside longer than we should have, watching the hedge, testing it without speaking. Every step we took along the fence was mirrored on the other side. The movement never crossed into the garden. It never pushed through the hedge. It followed the boundary with precision, as if the fence was a line it could not cross. Eventually the cold drove us back inside. We shut the door and locked it. The dogs did not relax. They remained low and alert for hours. When I looked through the back window later, the hedge was still. The garden lights showed nothing beyond the fence. That night I slept lightly. The house was warm, but the quiet pressed in. I woke several times, listening. The dogs never came upstairs. They stayed below, silent. When I looked out again before dawn, the hedge looked normal. No sign of disturbance. The next morning, in full daylight, I walked the fence line alone. The hedge on the greenbelt side was altered. The branches were bent and flattened and long, even arcs, not broken or snapped. It looked as if something tall had pressed sideways through them, shoulder first, moving parallel to the fence. The arcs were smooth and consistent, at about chest height. They did not look like wind damage. Wind tears unevenly. This was deliberate pressure. I followed the pattern for the length of the garden. It stopped exactly where the fence ended and the neighbor's hedge began. There, the branches sprang back into their usual shape, untouched. I tried to explain it to myself. Deer could do damage like that, but deer would cross fences. They would leave hoof marks, broken twigs, uneven paths. There were none. The ground showed no clear prints, only compressed leaves and soil, smoothed over by moisture. That evening, it happened again. The same movement, the same pacing, the same refusal to cross, the same silence from the dogs. I felt watched in a way that did not feel imagined. There was a presence that obeyed rules. On the third night, I stayed awake on purpose. I sat near the back window with the lights off, watching the hedge. Around midnight, the movement began. It started at the far end of the garden and moved slowly closer, stopping where the fence met the hedge. I could see the outline this time, not a shape, but a displacement. The hedge bowed inward, pressed flat in a long curve, as if leaned against by a broad surface. I noticed something else then. The movement was not fluid. It paused at regular intervals, as if adjusting footing. It moved sideways, not forward. That detail mattered later. In the morning, I examined the hedge again. The arcs were deeper. Some branches were pressed almost horizontal. The damage was repeated, always at the same height, always smooth. It was clear that whatever caused it returned often. The homeowner finally acknowledged it without surprise. The same thing happened every winter. Always when the neighborhood was quietest. Never in summer. Never when there was traffic or noise. It followed the fence line and left the hedge marked. It never entered the garden. It never triggered alarms. It never left obvious tracks. That explanation did not help. It confirmed a pattern without providing comfort. The final night, I decided to walk the fence line alone after dark. I wanted to understand the pace, the distance, the rule it followed. As I moved, the hedge moved. I stopped. It stopped. I stepped closer to the fence, leaning forward, listening. I heard nothing from it, but I heard something else behind me, faint and rhythmic. The sound came from the greenbelt beyond the hedge, farther back, not from the movement itself. It was a mechanical sound, distant and low, like fabric sliding against metal. I realized then that the hedge was not the source. It was a buffer. The explanation became clear in the following days, after I left and thought about it without fear sharpening every detail. The greenbelt backed onto a private stretch of land used by a nearby agricultural supplier. In winter, when fields were empty and roads quiet, workers moved equipment through the undeveloped strip to avoid traffic and complaints. One machine in particular matched everything I had seen. A tall, narrow agricultural sprayer mounted sideways on a tracked vehicle, moved along boundaries to test calibration and clear paths. Its profile was broad and flat. It moved laterally along hedges to avoid crossing fences. It made little noise at low power. Its height matched the arcs in the branches. Its tracks dispersed weight evenly, leaving minimal prints in damp soil. The operators avoided residential gardens and stayed just beyond fences. The dogs sensed vibration and unfamiliar pressure without the sharp cues of an animal. They froze instead of barking. The movement matched our pace because it was following a fixed route along the boundary, not reacting to us. When we stopped, it reached a turn or pause point and stopped as well. The winter timing matched the off-season testing schedule. The quiet nights reduced complaints. The homeowner had never looked beyond the hedge to confirm it, and no one else cared enough to investigate. The greenbelt hid the activity well. The machine never crossed into the yard because it was not meant to. It followed property lines by design. Understanding this did not erase the memory of standing in the dark, watched by something unseen that obeyed rules I did not know. It explained the arcs, the pacing, the silence. It grounded the experience in reality, but the feeling remained. The fear came from not knowing, from seeing movement without cause, from realizing how easily ordinary operations can become terrifying when stripped of context. I do not visit that house anymore. Not because I believe there was something unnatural there, but because I know how thin the line is between safe and unsettling. The hedge still stands. The greenbelt remains undeveloped. The machine still runs its routes in winter. And people inside warm houses still notice movement outside and feel watched, without ever seeing what it really is. My name isn't important. I grew up in a quiet cul-de-sac outside Pittsburgh, the kind of place where sound carried and nothing happened without someone noticing. The road curved inward like a bowl, with 12 houses facing each other across a strip of cracked asphalt and a shared storm drain. Lawns were trimmed. Mailboxes matched. People waved. It felt safe in the way that makes you stop paying attention. I was a nervous kid. By my mid-teens, around 2008, anxiety sat in my chest from morning to night. I couldn't name it then. I only knew that staying still made it worse. When the house went quiet, I walked. I waited until my parents went to bed, slipped on shoes, and stepped outside. The air at night felt thinner. My head cleared. I walked slow laps around the circle, sometimes twice, sometimes for an hour. Most nights looked the same. Porch lights off, a few living room lamps glowing, basement windows dark or faintly lit by a single bulb near a furnace. I knew which houses stayed up late and which shut down early. I knew the sound of every screen door. I noticed patterns because patterns made me calm. The night that changed everything started ordinary. It was late summer. The air held heat from the day, heavy but still. Crickets buzzed from the grass. I stepped onto the street and turned left, as I always did. Halfway down the first stretch, something felt off, though I couldn't place it yet. The feeling settled low in my stomach, the way it did when I forgot something important. I reached the third house and saw light pouring from the basement window. Not a soft glow, full brightness. The window was uncovered, no curtains, no blinds. I slowed without meaning to. Inside, a dark shape stood just behind the glass. At first, I thought it was a shadow from the stairs. Then I realized it had a head. The shape didn't move. It stood upright, facing outward. I could make out shoulders, arms at its sides. The light behind it was strong enough to show edges, but not features. I felt my breath change. I kept walking. The next house had the same thing. Basement light on. Window bare. Another shape, same height, same posture, facing the street. I stopped this time. I looked hard, waiting for a shift, a lean, a step. Nothing happened. I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe two people were doing laundry. Maybe I was reading shapes into shadows. Anxiety did that. I forced myself forward. By the fifth house, my mouth was dry. Every basement window glowed. Every window held a figure. They stood close enough to the glass that their outlines were clear. None of them moved. No heads turned. No arms lifted. It felt like the whole street was watching without blinking. I walked slower, counting my steps to stay steady. The air felt thicker. The sounds of insects faded, or maybe my focus narrowed. I became aware of my own footfalls, too loud on the pavement. I tried not to look directly at the windows, but my eyes kept sliding back. At one house, the figure looked taller. At another, broader. Some seemed closer to the glass. Others stood a foot back. All faced outward. All still. I reached the end of the cul-de-sac where the road curved. I should have turned back. Instead, I continued, completing the circle. I told myself I needed to see the rest. Turning around felt worse than going on. On the opposite side, nothing changed. Every basement light burned bright. Every window held a silhouette. The sameness made it worse. It felt planned. It felt deliberate. I scanned the yards for movement. No doors opened. No garage lights flicked on. Cars sat dark in driveways. The houses above the basements were quiet. Bedroom windows were black. Televisions were off. The street looked asleep except for what was happening below ground. I realized then that none of the figures blinked. I couldn't see eyes, but the stillness was wrong. Even someone standing at rest shifts weight. These shapes did not. My chest tightened. I felt the urge to run, but running would draw attention. I didn't know why I thought that. The idea landed fully formed and wouldn't leave. I kept walking at the same pace, eyes forward, hands loose, trying to look casual. As I passed the last house before my own, I felt a strange relief. The figure there stood farther back, near the stairs. For a second, I thought I saw something move. My heart jumped. Then I realized it was my reflection sliding across the glass as I walked by. I didn't look at my own house's basement window. I cut across the lawn and went inside, locking the door behind me. I stood in the dark kitchen and listened. The house was silent. No footsteps. No voices. I waited for something to happen and nothing did. I didn't sleep much that night. When morning came, everything looked normal again. Basement lights were off. Windows showed empty rooms. I walked the circle in daylight, slow and careful. No signs of people standing close to the glass. No marks. No notes. It felt like I had imagined the whole thing. Later that day, I paid attention to sounds. Lawn mowers started. Mail arrived. Neighbors went about their routines. No one looked tired. No one avoided eye contact. The street moved as it always had. Over the next week, I listened more than usual. I noticed schedules. Lights went out around 10. Cars stayed parked. Nothing strange happened again. I didn't walk at night for a while. Eventually, curiosity pushed past fear. I brought it up indirectly, asking my parents about the neighbors' habits. They said everyone turned in early. I paid attention at school, at the bus stop, anywhere I crossed paths with people from the street. No one mentioned being awake late. No one mentioned visitors or work in their basements. Years passed. I left home. I carried the memory with me, heavy and sharp. It never softened. Whenever I thought about that night, my body reacted as if it were happening again. I avoided the street when I visited. I parked farther away and walked in daylight. I needed an explanation. I needed something solid. In my late 20s, after my parents moved away, I drove back alone. The cul-de-sac looked smaller. Trees had grown. Paint colors changed. The shape of the place was the same. I parked and walked the circle one last time. I counted basement windows. 12 houses. 12 basements. I noted which windows faced the street directly and which were set back. I paid attention to how easy it would be to stand close to the glass without being seen from above. I went home and started digging through public records. It took time. Old township meeting notes. Police blotters. Insurance filings. Buried in paperwork from that year was a pattern I hadn't known to look for before. There had been a string of basement break-ins across nearby neighborhoods in late summer. Thieves targeted older homes with ground-level windows. They worked late at night. They moved fast and left little trace. The cul-de-sac had been flagged as vulnerable because of its layout and lack of through traffic. The Homeowners Association had approved a temporary security measure after a meeting held earlier that month. It wasn't widely advertised. Participation was voluntary but encouraged. A local security company offered a deterrent package at a discount. The package included high-watt basement lights, timers synced to the same hour, and life-size foam silhouettes mounted on weighted stands. The shapes were meant to suggest people awake and watching. The company claimed it reduced break-ins by making houses look occupied. The silhouettes were designed to stand still. Movement, according to the sales material, made them look fake. The program ran for 1 week. Most homeowners installed the setup on the same night to maximize effect. The lights turned on automatically at a preset time. The silhouettes were placed close to windows, facing outward, where they would be visible from the street. The instructions advised against curtains. Visibility was the point. In follow-up notes, several residents complained that the effect was unsettling and asked for removal after a few days. Others reported sleeping through the entire period and never noticing when the lights came on. I sat with that information for a long time. It explained the stillness. It explained the sameness. It explained why no one remembered being awake. It explained why the basements were empty the next day. It also explained something else I had felt but never named. The sense that the street itself was performing, presenting a face meant to be seen by someone else. That night, I had walked into the middle of a setup not meant for me. I drove back once more before leaving town for good. I stood at the edge of the cul-de-sac as the sun set. Basement lights stayed off. Windows reflected the darkening sky. The street looked harmless again. I didn't walk the circle. I didn't need to. I understood what I had seen. The fear came from context stripped away, from being the wrong audience at the wrong time. Even now, with everything explained, I don't go there after sunset. Knowing why doesn't change how it felt to pass house after house and see silent figures standing below ground, facing outward, waiting for someone to notice. I moved there because it was cheap and because cheap felt safer than empty. The breakup left me counting days by what I could carry and nights by how long I stayed awake. In late October 2016, I signed a short lease on a split level at the end of a cul-de-sac in a Midwestern suburb where the lawns were shaved flat and the mailboxes matched. The house had beige siding and a 2-car garage that smelled like old paint. Inside, the air held a faint dampness, not mold, more like a basement that had learned to behave. The landlord mentioned the previous tenant left suddenly. He said it as if it was weather. I didn't ask. I needed the price. The first week passed with boxes stacked and my mattress on the floor. Nights were quiet in the way suburbs are quiet, not empty, just managed. Sprinkler timers clicked. Furnace fans breathed. A freight train groaned miles away. I slept poorly, but blamed my own head. The second week, I noticed the lights. At 2:17 a.m. one night, I was awake on the couch, laptop dark, phone charging, when a motion light 2 houses down flicked on. It wasn't sudden. It ramped up, a soft bloom against siding. Then the next one came on, and the next, each separated by a pause long enough to feel counted. The lights traced a path along the curve of the cul-de-sac, not across the street, not toward driveways, but hugging sidewalks and the edges of lawns. It took maybe 15 minutes for the whole sequence to play out, from the far end back toward my place. No engine noise followed. No footfalls. No shadows slid across my windows. I told myself it was raccoons. Then I watched it again the next night. The timing changed, but the window stayed the same, somewhere between 2:10 and 2:40. The lights never jumped. They never skipped a house with a sensor. They never crossed asphalt. They moved as if something respected boundaries. In the mornings, I started checking the grass. The frost made it easier. Along the sidewalks, the blades lay pressed in long, uneven lines, parallel to the concrete. Not trampled, not churned, more like ironed. The width bothered me. It was too wide for a single person walking and too straight for any animal I knew. It looked deliberate. The lines faded by noon as sun and sprinklers did their work, but I learned where to look. I stayed because I couldn't afford to leave. That was the rule I applied to everything. I added deadbolts. I kept the blinds closed at night. I stopped sitting near windows. I bought a cheap camera and pointed it down the side yard. The footage showed nothing but darkness, and the occasional moth. The lights still came on. By the third week, I was timing it. I wrote the minutes in a notebook because writing felt like control. On nights when it rained, the lights still came on. On the first snow, they came on brighter. The pressed lines in the grass showed up as smooth troughs in the powder, edges clean, curves following the sidewalks with care. No footprints crossed them. I walked the cul-de-sac during the day slow, pretending to be the kind of person who enjoyed uniform hedges. I noticed small metal tags near the sidewalk every few houses, flush with the ground, stamped with codes I didn't recognize. Utility markers. Easements. The path of the lights followed them. Sleep thinned. My hearing sharpened. I started waking before the lights, body braced. When they came on, I watched from the hallway, heart loud, waiting for a sound that never came. It felt worse than noise. Silence felt intentional. I called the landlord's office once, left a message about the lights and the grass. I kept it neutral. I didn't mention fear. A week passed without a response. I checked the lease for clauses about entry and access. There was a paragraph about easements and right-of-way for utilities. It was boilerplate. I read it twice anyway. In early December, a city notice appeared taped to the cluster mailbox at the entrance of the street. I read it standing in the cold. It announced overnight work to assess infrastructure. Dates listed. Times listed. The window matched. The notice used words like survey and maintenance. It didn't explain method. It didn't mention equipment. It didn't mention silence. That night the lights came on again. I watched longer. I noticed the lights didn't trigger all at once within a yard. They rolled along the edge, as if something long moved past, close to the ground. I realized the shadows I expected weren't there, because the thing causing the lights was lower than the beams. I opened the door to the garage and stepped into the cold, staying behind the frame. I heard a sound then, faint, a soft rubbery whisper, like a tire rolling on wet grass. It passed without pause. The next light bloomed. In the morning, the lines in the grass were darker, damp pressed into soil. In one spot, near my driveway, the press dipped where the sidewalk cracked. A wheel had dropped and climbed. The width measured nearly 3 feet. I searched city permits online. Buried in a PDF was a contract award for a private firm tasked with nighttime utility mapping using ground-penetrating radar carts to avoid traffic and reduce interference. The carts were described as hand-pushed, wide for stability, with soft tires to protect lawns. Operators were instructed to remain on easements. Work hours listed were 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. I felt relief, and something like anger arrived together. It explained the path. It explained the timing. It explained the silence. The carts were electric. The operators wore dark clothing to avoid attention. The motion lights reacted to mass and movement, not faces. It didn't explain the previous tenant leaving suddenly. That piece still rattled. I pulled property records. The last tenant had filed a complaint the year before about unauthorized access and harassment. The resolution noted a misunderstanding related to contracted municipal work. No compensation. Lease terminated early. That night I watched again, knowing what it was. The fear didn't vanish. Knowing filled the dark with shape, but not comfort. The lights came on in sequence. The whisper passed. I saw nothing else. The next week, a letter arrived addressed to the occupant. It summarized the work completed on my street. It apologized for inconvenience. It provided a number. I didn't call. The work ended. The lights stopped coming on. The grass recovered. Months later, spring softened the place. The cul-de-sac looked the same as every other. I slept better. I moved on when my lease ended, not suddenly, with notice given and boxes counted. When I drove away, I noticed the metal tags again, small and exact, marking invisible systems that required quiet passage at night. The explanation fit every part of it. The fear stayed attached to the memory of not knowing, of staying because I couldn't afford to leave, of learning how easily ordinary work could feel like something else when it touched your hours and your home. I was in Ontario for a weekend in the fall of 2011, staying in the spare room of a friend's small 2-story place on a narrow residential street. The neighborhood felt settled and ordinary. Maples leaned over the road. Driveways held minivans. Lawns were edged tight. Across from his house sat another 2-story home, beige siding, white trim, broad windows on every floor. The first thing I noticed was that none of the windows had curtains, blinds, or anything else. Every room was open to the street. I could see straight through to the back wall on the ground floor, a line of door frames receding into dimness. It felt like looking into a staged display, the kind set up by builders before anyone moves in. During the day, the place looked empty. No furniture near the windows. No frames. No rugs. No signs of daily use. Light crossed the floors without catching on anything. It looked like a shell. I assumed someone had just moved out or had not finished settling in. When evening came and the sky drained to a cold blue, I expected lamps to glow in those exposed rooms. None did. The house across the street stayed dark. From the spare room, I could see the second-floor windows clearly. The glass reflected a little of the street, but not enough to hide the interior. At first, I thought my eyes were tired. Then I noticed movement. A soft crossing shape, tall and narrow, passed from left to right behind the glass. It had edges, but no detail. No color. It slid rather than walked. It crossed one room, vanished at a doorway, then appeared in the next window over. I watched until it was gone. I kept looking. After a while, another shape followed, shorter, wider, moving in the opposite direction. The room stayed unlit. The shapes did not cast shadows. They did not stop. I stood at the window longer than I meant to. The shapes returned in loose intervals, drifting from one room to the next. Sometimes they overlapped. Sometimes they paused near the glass and blurred, as if whatever made them had turned. Their movement was steady. No footfalls. No hesitation. It had the feel of people walking in a building where sound does not travel, but it also felt off, like the pace of a video played slightly slow. I mentioned the house the next morning and learned my friend believed no one lived there, and that no one had ever lived there since he had moved into his place. He treated it as a finished but unused property, kept up by someone who did not bother with window coverings. That explanation should have been enough. Instead, it sharpened my attention. All Saturday, the house stayed still. In daylight, the windows revealed nothing but pale walls and empty floors. From the sidewalk, I could see into rooms that should have held furniture. The place felt like a stage after the actors had left. When dusk returned, I watched again. The shapes came back. They appeared earlier than the night before, faint against the growing reflection of the street. I pulled the spare room chair closer to the glass. When I leaned forward, one of the shapes leaned too. When I shifted weight, another shape shifted in a distant window. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. Then I stepped back. A matching withdrawal happened across the street, a dark form sliding away from the pane. I raised my right arm. A right arm rose in a second-floor room opposite mine, the same slow arc, stopping a fraction of a second later. The lag unsettled me more than the match. The delay was slight, but it was there. I lowered my arm. The shape's arm lowered after it. I turned and walked a few steps left along the wall. A tall silhouette in the other house glided left through two windows. When I stopped, it stopped. When I took a step back, it came back. I left the room and paced the hall, then returned to the window. The shapes had rearranged, now occupying different rooms, but when I crossed in front of the glass, they crossed too. It was not a clean mirror. The spacing was off. The scale was off. There were more windows than our house had. My own outline broke into pieces and reformed, stretched across doorways, clipped by frames. The lag made it feel like something was watching and choosing to copy. The rest of the night, I kept testing small movements. A hand to the throat, a slow crouch, a turn. Each time, a response bloomed across the street. The shapes never led. They followed. The idea that someone might be inside, tracking us, rose and stuck. Yet the house showed no light, no signs of life. The movements were too smooth, too exact. Even the smallest shifts found echoes. By Sunday morning, the unease had settled into my muscles. The house across looked harmless in the sun. The glass flashed pale, reflecting the street, reflecting the sky. I crossed the road and stood in front of it. From close up, the windows had a faint tint, a gray sheen that caught the light. When I angled my face, I saw the street layered over the rooms inside. The glass was not clear in the way I had thought. It was reflective, more like the surface of an office building than a home. I could still see into the rooms, but the outside world pressed against them. I walked back and watched from the sidewalk as a car passed. Its motion slid across the windows and bent, doubling, a ghost of the vehicle gliding over empty walls. The effect was subtle. From across the street, in low light, it would have been stronger. That afternoon, I paid attention to how the sun struck my friend's house. As it dipped, the inside of the spare room brightened while the street dimmed. Our windows turned into mirrors. The ones across the street did the same, but in reverse. Their interior was darker than the road. Their glass gave back the street more than it admitted their rooms. The shapes I had watched were beginning to make sense. When night fell, I tried again. I turned off the spare room light and stood back. The window became a dark rectangle. I could see the opposite house more clearly. I took a step. The shapes moved. I turned on the room light. The glass in front of me brightened. My own reflection came forward, clean and bright, my outline crisp. Across the street, the shapes dulled and thinned. I raised my arm. My reflection rose immediately. In the distant windows, the movement appeared again, broken, delayed, spread across frames. I moved closer to the glass. The lag shrank. The shapes aligned more closely. I moved back. The delay grew. The farther I stood, the more the reflection split and slowed, bouncing between layers of glass, from our window to the air to theirs, each surface catching and passing the image on. The extra distance stretched the return. The house across had large, double-paned windows. So did my friends. 2 layers of glass on both sides of the street. Light from our room struck our window, reflected back to us, passed through, crossed the road, hit the other house's windows, reflected again, then returned, mixed with the faint view of empty rooms behind them. Each surface stole a little time, a little clarity. The shapes were us, delayed by distance and doubled by glass. I spent the last night proving it to myself in quiet ways. I set a chair at the window and moved it an inch at a time. The distant shapes rearranged, but always in step. I held a book and tilted it. A matching rectangle tilted back at me, broken into slats by window frames. I bent at the waist. The forms bent. I counted the beats between movement and return. The lag grew when I stepped back, shrank when I leaned forward. It behaved like reflection, not pursuit. The silence of the house across the street had done the rest. With no lights inside, no furniture near the glass, the windows had acted as dark mirrors. The street, the sky, our lit rooms had been the brightest things in view. The shapes had not been inside that house at all. They had been hovering in the space between, trapped in layers of glass. By morning, the fear had drained, leaving a thin embarrassment. I walked one last time across the road and looked through the windows. In full light, the interiors were plain and vacant. Clean floors, bare walls, no footprints, no marks, no sign of use. The glass reflected me faintly now, my outline lost in the bright street. The experience stayed with me because of how complete it had felt in the dark. The brain had done what it always does when detail is stripped away. It had filled the empty rooms with presence. It had given smooth motion to light and shadow. It had turned reflection into imitation, delay into intention. Nothing had been there. The house with no curtains had been a blank surface. I had supplied the rest.